Welcome back to Sleep Theories. Before we step into the dark together tonight, I want to take a moment to thank a listener who goes by the name Ilwyn eventually. This one is yours. Now settle in, let your shoulders drop, let the weight of the day slide off you like a coat you no longer need to wear. Tonight we're going somewhere very old. Not old the way a building is old the way a wound is old the way a story becomes old when it has been told so many times that people stop asking whether it actually happened. We're going to Suffolk, in the east of England, to a village with a strange and unlovely name, Woolpit. The name comes from the pits that were dug there long ago to trap wolves, back when wolves still moved through English forests in numbers that frightened farmers into digging holes in the earth. Wolf pits, Woolpit. And in the middle of the 12th century, according to two separate chroniclers who wrote independently of one another, something came out of those pits. Not a wolf, two children, a boy and a girl. Their clothing was made from a material nobody recognised. Their language matched nothing spoken anywhere in England, or in France, or in any of the trading tongues that moved through the ports of East Anglia. And their skin, both of them, was green. Not pale, not sickly, green. That is the historical record, and it is genuinely strange, and historians have been arguing about it for 800 years without resolving it. Because according to the conspiracy, the girl who came out of that pit was not lost. She was the first of us to arrive from somewhere else. Picture England in the year 1150. Understand first what darkness meant then. Not the soft dark of a bedroom with a streetlight bleeding around the curtains. Real darkness. The kind that arrives at dusk and does not lift until dawn, unbroken by anything except a tallow candle or a hearth fire that must be fed all night by somebody willing to stay awake and feed it. Into that darkness rides a man on a tired horse. His name is Brother Aldwine of Bury. He is a Benedictine monk, past 40, with the specific kind of patience that comes from spending 20 years copying other men's sentences by hand. His fingers are permanently stained. His back aches in a way that has become simply the shape of his body rather than a complaint. He has been travelling for 2 days along roads that are not really roads, only the memory of where carts have gone before. He's riding toward Woolpit because of a rumour. The rumour has been moving through the abbeys the way rumours moved in the 12th century, slowly, hand to hand, gathering weight and losing accuracy in equal measure. In Bury it arrived as a story about a miracle. In Thetford it arrived as a story about demons. Somewhere between the two it arrived as a story about children. 2 children, found in a field with green skin. Aldwine does not expect to find anything. He has ridden out to a dozen miracles in his life, and every single one has dissolved on close inspection into something ordinary and sad. A bleeding statue that turns out to be damp plaster and rust. A weeping child who turns out to be hungry. He rides toward Woolpit, already composing the polite letter he will send back to his abbot, explaining that there is nothing here. He arrives at dusk. The village is small enough that its entire population fits into the space between the church and the mill. They come out to meet him because a monk on a horse is an event. They want him to bless the children. They want him to declare something. They are frightened in the specific way that people are frightened when they have found something they do not have a category for. And then they bring the children out. The boy is thin, unsteady, held upright by a woman who has clearly appointed herself his keeper. The girl stands on her own. She's perhaps 11 years old, and she's watching Aldwine with an attention so complete that he feels, briefly, that he is the one being investigated. Their skin is green, not painted, not dyed. Green the way a leaf is green, softly, evenly, all the way to the beds of their fingernails. Aldwine forgets his letter. He steps down from the horse. He kneels, slowly so as not to frighten them, and he holds out his hands to show that they are empty. And the girl screams. It happens so fast that the villagers stumble backward. The girl is pointing, her whole arm rigid, and she's not pointing at his face or his hands. She's pointing at his chest where his silver cross hangs against his robe. except she is not pointing at the cross. Hanging on the same cord, worn smooth by decades of handling, is a small stone pendant. Aldwine has worn it since he was a novice. It came from the Abbey's own collection of unremarkable relics, a flat grey stone carved with a spiral and a line, its origin unrecorded, its meaning forgotten centuries before he was born. He has never thought about it. It is simply the thing that hangs next to the cross. The girl is staring at that stone as though it has spoken her name. She whispers something in her own language, 3 syllables, over and over, her voice shaking. And Aldwine, watching her face, understands something he will spend the rest of his life trying to unlearn. She's not afraid. She's homesick. To understand what happened, you have to go back a few weeks, to the harvest. The historical account tells us this part plainly. It was harvest season. The workers were out in the fields near the Woolpits, the old trenches dug into the earth on the edge of the cultivated land, and they heard something. Crying. Not an animal. Children crying, thin and exhausted, coming up out of the ground. Imagine being one of those workers. Imagine the sound arriving across a field of cut grain in the late afternoon, and the way everyone stops at once. Scythes half lifted, all of them looking at each other to confirm that they heard the same thing. They found the children at the mouth of one of the pits. They were filthy. They were disoriented. They flinched violently from the sunlight, shielding their eyes with their forearms, turning their faces away from the sky as though the sky itself were the thing hurting them, and their skin was green. The workers did what people generally do when confronted with something impossible. They fell back on procedure. They brought the children to the manor of a man named Sir Richard de Calne at Wykes, because when something inexplicable happens in a medieval village, you take it to whoever owns the land. At the manor, 3 things became clear very quickly. The first was the clothing. It was not English. It was not anything anyone could place. The chroniclers describe it as being of an unfamiliar colour and material, and that phrase has been chewed over by scholars for centuries. In a country where every household could identify wool from 3 villages away by touch, where fabric was so valuable it was itemised in wills, clothing that nobody could identify was not a small detail. It was the equivalent of finding someone in a spacesuit. The second was the language. They spoke constantly at first to each other and to anyone who would listen, and nobody understood a word. Woolpit was rural, but East Anglia was not isolated. The ports brought in Flemish, Norse, French, Latin, Frisian, the whole trading vocabulary of the North Sea. Men were found who spoke all of it. None of them recognised a single sound the children made. The third was the food. They were starving. That was obvious. And yet they refused everything they were offered. Bread, meat, cheese, everything the manor could put in front of them they turned away from. Not with the fussiness of full children, with something closer to incomprehension, as though they were being offered objects rather than food. Then someone brought in beans. Broad beans, still on the stalk, freshly cut. And the children reacted the way you would react to a rope thrown to you in deep water. They seized the stalks. They tore them open at the stems, searching for the beans inside the stalk rather than in the pods, which is not where beans are, and finding nothing, they began to cry again. Somebody, gently, showed them the pods, and they ate. For weeks afterward, that was the only thing they would eat. Broad beans, nothing else. Sit with that image for a moment. 2 children in a stone hall in the 12th century, green as spring wheat, eating raw beans by candlelight, while grown men stand around the walls watching them and quietly making the sign of the cross. Nobody in that room had a word for what was happening. They had words for angels. They had words for demons. They had words for fairies, for changelings, for the folk under the hill. They had a rich and detailed vocabulary for the uncanny, far richer than ours, and none of it fit. The boy did not live long. The chroniclers agree on this. Both children were baptised, and shortly afterward the boy sickened and died. He faded, is the sense you get from the accounts. He did not fight it. He grew quieter and thinner, and then he was gone, and they buried him in consecrated ground with a name that was not his own. The girl lived. More than that, the girl adapted. She learned to eat other food. Her skin, according to the accounts, slowly lost its green colour, becoming ordinary over a period of months. She learned English. She took work in the household. The chroniclers, with the faint disapproval of monastic writers describing any woman with spirit, note that she grew up to be somewhat loose in her conduct, which almost certainly means only that she was young and lively and did not behave like a nun. And once she could speak English, they asked her the question everyone had been holding for months. Where did you come from? Her answer is the reason this story survived 800 years. She said her home was a country where the sun never truly rose. There was light, but it was the light of a long evening that never became night and never became morning. A perpetual twilight, soft and green, in which everything grew and everyone lived, and nobody had ever seen a sky like the one above Woolpit. She said the people there were Christians. She said there were churches. She said the land was called St. Martin's Land, and that everything in it was green, the fields, the people, the light itself. She said that across a great river they could see another country, a bright country, a land full of light that they could never reach, shining on the far side of the water like a window into somewhere else. And she said that she and her brother had been tending animals when they heard a sound. Bells, church bells, ringing somewhere far off, coming to them through the ground. They followed the sound. It led them into a cavern, and the cavern led them deeper, and they walked for a long time in the dark toward a noise that kept receding ahead of them. Until eventually there was light at the end of it. Terrible light. More light than either of them had ever experienced. And they stumbled out of the earth into a harvest field in Suffolk, and were immediately completely blinded by the ordinary afternoon sun. They tried to go back. They could not find the entrance again. Now, everyone who heard that story in the 12th century reached for the same explanation. A country of perpetual light seen across a river. Bells. Christians. This was heaven, or somewhere adjacent to it. The girl had come from a spiritual place, and her story was a parable, and the correct response was reverence and a certain amount of theological caution. Brother Aldwine, standing at the back of the hall listening to her describe a dim green world beneath a sun that never rose, thought something entirely different. He thought about that stone pendant. He thought about how she had recognised it. And he thought, with a coldness that started in his stomach and spread outward, that she had not been describing heaven at all. She had been describing home. Ordinary, specific, geographic home. The way you would describe your village to a stranger. With the flat, unmiraculous detail of someone who had grown up somewhere and never once thought it was remarkable. Nobody describes heaven by mentioning that the light is inconvenient. Aldwine went back to Bury St. Edmunds and did the only thing he knew how to do. He read. Understand what a monastic library was in the 12th century. It was not a room with books, it was a memory. It was the accumulated written residue of 500 years of men copying whatever came into their hands, faithfully, without editing, including things they did not understand and things that frightened them, and things that had been copied so many times from so many damaged originals that the sentences no longer entirely worked. Most of it was liturgy and law, and the lives of saints. But in every library there was a shelf, or a chest, or in Bury's case a cupboard in a cold corridor, containing the material that had no category. Fragments, marginalia, letters between houses about matters nobody had bothered to explain because both writers already knew the context. Aldwine started there, and he was looking for one thing. Other times this had happened. It took him most of a winter. What he found, he recorded in a personal journal, which is the document at the centre of this entire story and which, according to the conspiracy, is the reason he eventually disappeared. The first entry that mattered was a fragment from a Frankish monastery, dated roughly 300 years earlier. It described a man found wandering near a mill, unable to speak any known language, who was fed and housed by the brothers for a season. The fragment described his skin as being of an unnatural cast. It did not say green. It said, in Latin, that he had the colour of a man who has never been warmed, and it noted that he wept whenever the sun was directly overhead. The second was older, a marginal note in a different hand than the text it accompanied, in a copy of a chronicle from the north. It mentioned, without explanation, the lands beneath God's shadow. Nothing more. 4 words in the margin of a page about a bishop's funeral, written by someone who evidently expected the reader to know what the phrase meant. The third was the one that kept him awake. It was a letter, copied and recopied, from one abbot to another, and it concerned a woman found near a well in what is now Lombardy. She spoke no known tongue. She drew repeatedly the same shape on the ground with a stick, and she became distressed when anyone erased it. The letter described her as being from the mirrored kingdom, and it used the phrase as though it were a place, the way you would write Normandy or Aquitaine. And then the letter said something that Aldwine copied twice, once in the text and once again at the bottom of the page, as if to make sure he would see it later. The writer instructed the receiving abbot that the woman was to be sent to Rome, immediately, quietly, and that no record of her arrival was to be kept in the house. Aldwine sat in the cold and worked his way through it. Over the following months he found 11 such accounts, spread across 500 years and 4 countries, different places, different centuries, different languages, written by men who could not possibly have read each other's work, and every one of them ended the same way. The stranger was taken somewhere else, and the record stopped. Not a death, not a burial, not a conclusion of any kind. Simply an account that runs along in ordinary detail and then, at the moment of the stranger's removal, falls completely silent, like a voice cut off mid-sentence. Aldwine wrote one line in his journal that night, and it is the line that begins everything that follows. Somebody is collecting them. The reply came in spring. Aldwine had written, carefully and without stating what he actually suspected, to 4 houses that held old collections. 3 of them answered politely and unhelpfully. The 4th answer did not come as a letter. It came as a man. He arrived at Bury on an ordinary Tuesday, unannounced, travelling alone, dressed as a Benedictine and carrying nothing but a satchel. He gave his name as Brother Osric. He asked to speak with Aldwine privately, and when they were alone in the scriptorium with the door shut, he set the satchel on the table and did not open it. He said, without any preliminary at all, that Aldwine should stop writing letters. What followed, according to the conspiracy, was the first honest conversation about this subject that had taken place in England in 200 years. Osric belonged to something. It had no charter and no house of its own. It appeared in no papal register. Its members were ordinary monks in ordinary abbeys who happened once or twice in a lifetime to receive a particular kind of instruction. Among themselves they used a name, and the name was the Order of St. Veritas. Veritas. Truth. The joke, Osric said, was old and had stopped being funny centuries ago. They were named for truth because their entire function was to bury it. Officially, insofar as anything about them was official, they investigated heresy. That was the cover, and it was a good one, because heresy investigations gave a man the authority to go anywhere, read anything, question anyone, and seal any document he chose without explaining himself. A brother of the order could walk into a village where something impossible had happened, take custody of the impossible thing, and depart, and the only record would be a line in a register noting that a matter of doctrine had been resolved. What they actually did was maintain a map, not of countries, of places, specific locations, scattered across Europe and beyond it, where the world did not behave correctly, where people occasionally arrived who should not exist, and where people occasionally vanished and were never recovered. The order did not know why these places existed. They had no theory that satisfied anyone. They had only the map, which had been added to for at least 800 years, and a set of procedures. The procedures were simple and brutal in their clarity. Identify the location, contain the location, remove any witnesses to a place where they can be questioned and kept, ensure no written account survives outside the Order's own archive, and, wherever possible, build something on top of it. Aldwine asked what they built. Osric said, churches, almost always churches, because a church is the one structure that a medieval community will maintain forever, that nobody will demolish, that will be rebuilt on the same foundation for 1,000 years, and that gives a reason for consecrated men to be present at all times, without anyone asking why. You do not seal a door, Osric said. Doors do not stay sealed. You put a building on top of it, and you fill the building with people who pray, and then you make sure that for the next 1,000 years there is always somebody standing on it. Aldwine sat with that. Then he asked the question he had been holding since the previous autumn. He asked how many of the strangers the Order had taken. Osric was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that he did not know the number, because the number was not written in any single place, deliberately. But he knew this much. He had personally escorted 2 in his life. He was 38 years old, and the girl at Woolpit, he said, was going to be the 3rd. Aldwine did not sleep that night, and in the morning he asked to see the map. Osric refused. Then, 3 days later, he changed his mind, which was itself a kind of answer about how much of the Order's discipline had begun to erode by the 12th century. What he showed Aldwine was not a map in the way we would recognise one. It was a list. Place names, in Latin, in a dozen different hands, going back so far that the earliest entries used Roman administrative divisions that had not existed for 600 years. Beside each name was a date, or a range of dates, and a single letter code whose meaning Osric explained only partially. The pattern was the thing. Aldwine had spent 20 years copying manuscripts, which is to say, he had spent 20 years training his eye to notice when something recurs, and what recurred here, once he had the list in front of him, was almost unbearable. They were on high ground and low water, springs, wells, caves, the heads of rivers, places where water came out of the earth or went into it, hills with old names that predated Christianity, and in several cases predated Latin, sites that had been sacred before anyone in the region had heard of Rome, and had gone on being sacred through every change of religion, as though the sacredness were a property of the ground rather than a decision made by people. And on top of a great many of them now stood churches. Osric called them thin places. He said the term was not the Order's invention. It was older and vaguer, and it appeared in Irish material centuries before the Order began writing anything down. A thin place was somewhere the distance between here and elsewhere had, for reasons nobody could explain, become very small. Most of them were dormant. That was the crucial thing. A thin place could sit quietly for 400 years and do absolutely nothing, and a village could grow up around it and hold weddings and funerals on top of it, and never notice a single strange thing. And then it would open. Not predictably. Not on any cycle the Order had ever been able to establish, though generations of brothers had tried, filling pages with lunar calculations and tidal tables and astrological nonsense that never once produced a working prediction. They simply opened, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for a season, occasionally, according to the oldest entries, for years, and those were the entries with the largest numbers of missing people beside them. The signs were consistent enough to be useful. Livestock that would not go near a particular field. Dogs that stared at nothing. Compasses, in the centuries after compasses arrived, that lied. Bells that rang in still air. Light where there was no source of light, described in the records with a persistence that Aldwine found more convincing than any single dramatic account, because 11 different men in 9 different centuries had all reached for the same inadequate word, green. And beneath Woolpit, in a network of old caverns that ran under the wolf pits and out toward the church, there was an entry on the list. It had been made in the year 840. It was over 300 years old. Beside it, in a hand so faded that Osric had to hold the page toward the window, was a note, sealed, insufficiently. Aldwine went back to Woolpit that summer, and he did something the Order had never thought to do. He asked her questions, not theological questions, not the questions everyone else had been asking her, which were all variations of what did you see, and was it beautiful, and were there angels? He asked her the questions you would ask a traveller about a country you were considering visiting. He asked what the weather was like, he asked what they grew, and when they harvested it, and whether the harvest was reliable. He asked how long the day was, and how they measured it, and how they knew when to sleep. He asked what the buildings were made of, and how the roofs were pitched, and whether it snowed. She answered all of it, immediately and without hesitation, in the flat, practical way a farmer's daughter answers questions about farming. And what she described, when Aldwine assembled it over the course of that summer, was not a spiritual realm. It was a place with problems. The light, she said, was always the same. There was a slow brightening and a slow dimming, and people worked in the brightening and slept in the dimming, but there was never a sun in the way that he meant. There was a glow behind the sky. Sometimes, on rare occasions, you could see a shape behind it, a pale disk, very dim, and people considered that a good omen and also a sign that the season would be hard. Crops grew slowly, everything grew slowly. She could not understand how the wheat around Woolpit had come up in a single season. She thought at first that Aldwine was lying to her, and when she finally accepted it she cried, which he had not expected and did not entirely understand until much later. The buildings were low and wide, with broad, flat roofs to catch as much light as possible. There were animals, but fewer kinds than here, and she was fascinated by ordinary English birds in a way that suggested she had never seen anything like a sparrow. And the people were green, all of them, everyone she had ever met in her life. She had assumed when she first arrived that the people of Woolpit were sick. Aldwine wrote his conclusion in the journal that autumn, and it is a genuinely remarkable piece of reasoning for a man in the 12th century with no framework to support it. He wrote that the green was not a miracle and not an affliction. He wrote that it was the same thing as the difference between a man who works in a field and a man who works in a scriptorium. He had seen his own hands go pale over 20 years indoors. He had watched novices arrive brown as bread and fade. If a man's colour could change that much in one life, from nothing more than the amount of light falling on him, then what would happen to a people who lived for 1,000 generations under a sky like the one she described? They would change, not by miracle, by simply continuing. And whatever their bodies had done to survive under a dim green sky, whatever they had built into themselves over all those centuries to catch every scrap of that weak light, it had left them the colour of the light itself. They were not cursed, they were adapted, which meant St. Martin's Land was not a vision or a parable or a corner of the afterlife. It was a place, a real place, with weather and crops and bad years, a place where people worried about the harvest, and it was, somehow, right here. Aldwine had missed the boy's death by 3 weeks, and it haunted him for the rest of his life, because by the time he understood what he was looking at, the body was already in the ground. The historical account is brief. The boy was baptized. He grew ill. He died. The chroniclers offer no cause, because in the 12th century death did not require a cause. Children died. It was the background condition of existence. But Aldwine went back and asked patiently over weeks, and what he assembled from the villagers who had cared for the boy was not a picture of any illness he had ever seen. It began with his skin, not the green. The green stayed. But within days of arriving, the exposed parts of him, his face and forearms and the backs of his hands, began to burn. Not gradually, violently, and out of all proportion to the amount of sun he'd been in. The woman who had nursed him described blistering after a single overcast afternoon. She described skin coming away from him like the skin of a scalded apple. They kept him indoors after that. It did not stop. Then his eyes. He could not tolerate any light at all, not even candlelight, and he spent his final weeks in a shuttered room in the dark, which everyone assumed was helping, and which, Aldwine came to believe, was simply where they had put him, because they did not know what else to do. Then he stopped eating. Then he stopped speaking, though nobody could understand him anyway, so it took several days for anyone to notice. And then, quietly, on a morning in early spring, he was gone. The villagers said he had died of grief for his home, and there was a kindness in that explanation, and Aldwine did not argue with it. But in his journal he wrote something else. He wrote that the boy had been poisoned by the sun, not sunlight as a moral force, sunlight as a substance, the same way a man can drown in water that is perfectly good to drink. The boy had come from somewhere that had never given him a reason to build a defence against what fell out of an English sky in April, and from the moment he stepped into that harvest field, every hour of every day had been quietly taking him apart. The girl had survived because she was older and stronger, and because after that first day she had learned very quickly to stay out of the light. She had spent her first months in England hiding indoors, which everyone read as shyness. It was not shyness. It was the instinct of an animal that has correctly identified what is trying to kill it. Aldwine went out to the grave. It was in the churchyard, unmarked, because nobody had known his name. Somebody had put a stone at the head of it anyway. Somebody had cared enough to do that much. And Aldwine, standing over it in the rain, worked out the implication that had been waiting for him since the beginning, and that would drive everything he did afterward. If our sunlight killed the boy in 5 weeks, then whatever comes through from that side cannot survive here. And if their world is as dim as she says, then whatever goes through from this side cannot survive there, 2 worlds a single step apart, and neither one of them able to live in the other. She drew it in the autumn, and she drew it in secret, and the only reason we know about it at all is that Aldwine walked into the room at the wrong moment. He had been away for 11 days. When he came back to the manor, he found her alone in the small room off the kitchen, where the household kept its salt, sitting on the floor with a tray of ash from the hearth spread flat in front of her, drawing in it with her finger. She looked up when the door opened, and her hand moved instinctively to sweep it away. He asked her, very quietly, not to. She let him look. At first he thought it was England. There was a coastline, there were rivers, forking correctly. There was a shape in the southeast that could have been the estuary of the Thames, and a bulge in the east that was recognisably East Anglia. And this alone was extraordinary, because she had never seen a map in her life, and had certainly never been shown one of England. Then he looked properly, and his skin went cold. There were 2 of them, 2 coastlines, 2 sets of rivers, 2 Englands drawn side by side, each complete, each detailed, and they were not identical. Close, but not identical. Like 2 copies of the same document written out by 2 different scribes, agreeing on every important thing and differing everywhere it did not matter. A river that forked here instead of there, a bay slightly deeper, a range of hills that ran a few degrees further north, and between them, dividing the ash into 2 halves, she had drawn a river, a long winding line, wider than any river she'd drawn inside either country, running from the top of the tray to the bottom. Aldwine pointed at it. She said a word in English that she had clearly assembled herself, because it was not a phrase anyone in Suffolk would have used. The boundary, water. He asked if it was the sea. She said no. She said you could see across it. She said that everyone in her village had stood on the bank of it at some point in their lives and looked at the bright country on the other side, and that no one had ever crossed it, because it could not be crossed, because it was not the kind of thing you crossed by moving. Then she did something that Aldwine recorded with his handwriting visibly deteriorating. She put her finger on a point in the eastern part of her country, in the position where Woolpit would be. Then she reached across the boundary water and put her finger on the same point on the other side. The bright country. Our England. Woolpit again. And she moved her finger back and forth between them twice, and looked up at him to see whether he had understood. The same place. 2 versions of the same place, occupying the same ground, separated by something she could only draw as a river because a river was the only thing she had ever seen that divided a landscape into a here and a there. Aldwine understood then what she had been trying to tell everyone since she arrived, and what everyone had been too busy asking her about heaven to hear. She was not drawing geography. There was nowhere to go. There was no direction you could walk in to reach St. Martin's Land. No ship you could take. No distance you could cover. It was not far away. It was not below or above. It was here, exactly here, in the same field and the same hill and the same Woolpit, laid over England like a second page pressed against the first. And the caves were not tunnels between 2 places. They were the places where the 2 pages touched. There was one part of her story she had never told anyone, and Aldwine got it out of her only after the map, and only because by then she had decided to trust him. He asked her why, if the caves connected the 2 worlds, and if her people knew the caves were there, nobody had ever come through before. She said, "They do not let you." Then she told him about the shepherds. They were not, she said, a story told to frighten children, though children were certainly frightened by them. They were a real feature of life in her country, in the way that a tax collector is a real feature of life. Everyone knew about them. Nobody talked about them much. There were rules, and the rules were understood, and the rules were kept. The rule was this: you did not go into the deep caves, not the shallow ones. The shallow caves were used for storage and shelter and were entirely ordinary. But past a certain depth, in the places where the older passages ran, the rule became absolute, and it was enforced not by any authority anyone could name, but by the simple fact that people who went deep did not come back. The shepherds moved down there. She described them as tall and as covered, and she was very precise that she did not mean cloaked, because cloak was a word she had learned in England, and it was not right. Covered, she said, wrapped. Faceless in the sense that there was nothing to see, not in the sense that something had been hidden. They carried lights. That was the detail she returned to. Not torches. Steady, small, cold lights that did not flicker and did not smoke. And they did not chase you. That was the part that had frightened her most in the telling. They did not hunt. They simply turned you back. If you went down and you met one, it would stand in the passage, and you would find that you did not want to continue, and you would go home, and you would not entirely remember why you had stopped. Aldwine asked what happened to the people who did not come back. Then, if the shepherds only turned people away. She said that some people did not turn back. He asked how she and her brother had got past them, and she said the thing that Aldwine wrote in his journal, in letters so heavy, he tore the parchment. She said they had not got past them. She said the shepherds had let them through. She said she had seen one. She said it had been standing at a branching of the passage, holding its cold light, and it had watched the 2 of them walk toward the sound of the bells, and it had not moved, and it had not turned them back, and she had been so frightened that she had simply kept walking because stopping seemed worse. She said she had thought about it every day since. She said, and this is the line that made Aldwine understand that she was not a lost child, but a witness to something with intent behind it, that she thought the shepherds had been waiting. Not to stop them, to see whether the way was still open, and to see, when the 2 of them stepped out into the harvest light of another world, whether anything would come back. The envoy arrived in the following spring, and he did not come the way Osric had come. He came with 4 men, and letters, and horses that had cost more than Woolpit's entire annual tithe, and he did not present himself at the abbey. He went directly to Sir Richard de Calne's manor and produced a document, and whatever was in that document ended all discussion in the room within the space of a minute. His name, insofar as the journal records it, was Cardinal Deacon Gualtiero. He had come from Rome. He had been travelling since the previous autumn, which means he had left before the second harvest, which means Rome had known about the green children within months of their appearance. Think about what that means at 12th century speed. News travelled at the pace of a rider, and a rider travelled at the pace of a horse, and between Suffolk and Rome lay the Channel, the Alps, and roughly 1,500 miles of variable politics. For a Roman cardinal to be standing in a Suffolk manor house that spring, someone had put a letter into the hands of a courier within weeks of the children coming out of the ground, and that courier had ridden hard the entire way, and Rome had responded not with a request for more information, but with a man and an escort. Rome had not been informed. Rome had been alerted. Aldwine, who was present because Sir Richard had sent for him, and who describes the entire scene in the journal with the flat attentiveness of a man who knows he is watching something he was never meant to see, records that Gualtiero asked exactly 3 questions. He asked whether there had been 2. He asked whether one had died, and he asked where the entrance was. He did not ask what the children looked like. He did not ask what language they spoke. He did not ask whether they had said anything about heaven, which was the only question anyone in England had cared about for 2 years. He did not ask, at any point in the entire interview, whether the story was true. He asked where the entrance was. Sir Richard, to his enormous credit, said he did not know, which was accurate. Gualtiero then said the thing that Aldwine underlined. He said in Latin that the girl was to be prepared for travel, and that she would be leaving within the week, and that she was being taken into the care of the church for the good of her soul. And Aldwine, sitting at the side of the room with his hands in his sleeves, understood that he was watching the 11th account come to its ending. The stranger is taken somewhere else, and the record stops. He went out into the yard afterward and stood in the cold for a long time. Then he went and found Osric, who had arrived quietly the night before and had said nothing to anyone, and he asked him one question. He asked what happens to them in Rome. Osric did not answer for a while. Then he said that he did not know, and that he had asked once, 20 years ago, and had been told that the question was not his to ask, and that he had never asked again. Then he said something else. He said that the order had been sealing the doors for 800 years, and that in all that time they had never once been ordered to open one, until now. Osric took him to Rome, not by invitation. Osric took him the way a man takes a friend into a burning building, knowing exactly what it will cost and doing it anyway, and the journal is not clear about why, though a reader can guess. Osric had escorted 2 strangers in his life. He had put them into the hands of the church and gone home and continued. And somewhere in the intervening years, something in him had quietly stopped agreeing. They travelled through the summer. They arrived in the autumn, and in a building that Aldwine describes only as being near enough to the Lateran to hear its bells, in a room below ground level with a door that required 2 keys held by 2 men, Osric showed him the archive. It was not large. That was the first shock. Aldwine had expected a library and found perhaps 300 items, most of them small, several of them not documents at all. But they went back. The earliest material was not in Latin. It was Greek, and beneath the Greek there were things older still, fragments of copies, and among them Aldwine found a Roman military report. He copied it entire. It is the centrepiece of his journal. It was from a garrison in Britannia in the 2nd century, and it concerned a mining operation. Soldiers had opened a passage. Something had come up through it. The report was written by an officer with a beautifully clear administrative style, and it described, without a trace of superstition, the appearance of 11 individuals from within the rock, none of whom spoke Latin or any British tongue, all of whom were described as having skin the colour of oxidised copper. The officer's recommendation was that the passage be collapsed and the individuals transported to the provincial capital. At the bottom, in a different hand, was a single added line confirming that this had been done, and the phrase used for the passage was not a Latin word Aldwine recognised. It was a transliteration of something, badly, from a language the scribe had not known. He found the same word 11 more times, across 9 centuries, in 6 different languages, always transliterated, always slightly differently, always by someone who did not know what it meant and was copying the shape of it out of respect or fear. The church had known since Rome. Before the church was the church, before it had a pope or a doctrine or a single stone building of its own, The institution it grew out of had inherited a filing cabinet full of impossible people, and it had simply continued the filing. And the last item in the archive was the newest. It was a list, in a modern hand, of 19 locations. Beside 17 of them was the same word, which meant sealed. Beside one was a word meaning dormant. And beside the last one, written in the previous year, in ink that had not yet fully browned, was a location in Suffolk, England, and a single word that made Aldwine sit down on the floor of that archive and put his head in his hands. Aperta. Open. Aldwine asked the obvious question that night, in a room above a wine seller's shop where 2 English monks had no business being. Why hide it? If there is another world and God made both, then surely the discovery glorifies him. Surely this is the largest piece of good news since the resurrection. Why bury it? Why spend 800 years and untold quantities of the Church's money and attention on making sure that nobody ever finds out? And Osric gave him an answer that Aldwine recorded carefully, and which is, according to the conspiracy, the entire reason the story of the Green Children survives only as a piece of folklore about children who ate beans. He said, think about what people will decide it is. They will not decide it is another country. Nobody in Christendom has the equipment to think that. They will decide it is heaven, or hell, or purgatory, and they will decide it within a day, and once they have decided it, nothing will ever change their minds, and then they will go looking for the door. Osric said, you have seen a pilgrimage. You have seen what happens when a village acquires a saint's finger bone. You have seen 10,000 people walk 400 miles to touch a box. Now imagine a hole in the ground where you can see the next world. Every dying man in Europe walks to Suffolk. Every grieving mother, every penitent, every heretic, every mystic, every king who is afraid of what is waiting for him. Every man who has lost a child and would like to have one more conversation with them, they will come, and they will keep coming, and they will not stop coming, and when they arrive and find the entrance sealed, they will dig. And Osric said, that is only the ordinary people. Consider the kings, because it is a country. It has land in it, land that no one has claimed, land that is not held by anyone with an army. And the first prince who understands that will not send pilgrims. He will send engineers, and then he will send men, and he will do it for the same reason princes have always done it, and the other princes will do it too, because they cannot afford to let him have it alone. We would go through, Osric said in numbers, into a world of people who cannot survive our sunlight, and whose weapons we know nothing about, and whose grain does not grow at our speed. We would not be pilgrims there. We would be a plague. Aldwine sat with it, and then he said the thing that had been sitting in his chest since the churchyard, and which he had not said out loud to anyone. He said they cannot come here either. Their children burn in our April. Their grain would blind in our June. A man from St. Martin's Land cannot walk across an English field at noon and live to reach the far hedge. So it is not an invasion we are preventing, he said. It is a slaughter, and it only runs one way. And Osric said nothing at all, which Aldwine took correctly as agreement. Understand what that means for the shape of this story. The Church was not protecting a secret to hold power over it. That is what a conspiracy usually is. That is what everyone assumes when they hear the word. The Church, in this telling, had looked through a hole in the world at a dim green country full of people who could not defend themselves against the simple fact of our sky. And it had decided coldly, in a room somewhere, 800 years before Woolpit, that the kindest thing anyone could do for either world was to make absolutely certain that neither one ever learned the other was real, not a lie to gain something, a lie to prevent something, which is in the end a far more frightening kind of lie. Because a lie told for gain can be broken by exposing it. A lie told for mercy has to be maintained forever. They rode back through the winter and arrived in Suffolk in the wet grey end of February, and the first thing they learned was that the girl was still there. Gualtiero had not taken her. The reason, when Aldwine finally pieced it together, was almost funny, in the way that only medieval bureaucracy can be. Sir Richard de Calne had raised an objection about jurisdiction, not out of any great moral courage, out of pride and a dislike of Roman clergy giving orders on his own land, and a lawyer's instinct that a document produced in a hurry can usually be argued with. The argument had gone to Bury, and from Bury toward Canterbury, and it had done what such arguments do, which is to sit in a pile getting slowly older. The girl had been saved by paperwork. But the second thing they learned was worse. Woolpit had gone wrong. It had started before Christmas, and by February the village had stopped pretending it was ordinary. The signs came in the order the order's own record said they always came, which Aldwine noted with the particular horror of a man watching a prediction come true. The animals went first. Sheep would not use the eastern pasture. They would go to the gate and stop and simply refuse, and shepherds who had worked that field for 20 years said they had never seen anything like it. 2 dogs ran off entirely and did not come back. The rest would not go past the churchyard wall after dark, and one of them had begun sitting at the wall in the evenings and staring at the field beyond it for an hour at a time without moving. Then livestock started disappearing. Not slaughtered, which would have left blood, and not stolen, which would have left tracks, simply gone, between one night and the next, out of enclosed fields with the gate still shut. Then the bells. The church bell at Woolpit rang 3 times that winter with nobody in the tower. The first time, the priest ran up the stairs and found the rope still and the bell swinging and the door bolted from inside the church. The second time, half the village heard it. The third time, it rang for what several witnesses independently described as a long time, and when it stopped, everyone in Woolpit came out of their houses into the dark and stood in the road looking at each other, and nobody said anything, and after a while they all went back inside. And the shadows. This is the detail Aldwine writes about most carefully, because it is the one that broke his composure. In the field above the wolf pits, in the late afternoon, the shadows fell in the wrong direction. Not all of them, not always. But a fence post would throw its shadow east while the sun was in the west, and it would do it for a few minutes and then it would stop. He went out and watched it happen. He stood in that field with his own shadow lying correctly on the ground in front of him, and watched a hawthorn tree 30 feet away cast a shadow toward a sun that was not there. He wrote, that evening, that he had finally understood the phrase in the margin, "The land's beneath God's shadow." It was not poetry. Somewhere very close to Woolpit a second sky was leaking through. They went down on the last night of February, 3 of them. Aldwine, Osric, and the girl, who was by then perhaps 14 years old, and who had refused, absolutely and without any possibility of negotiation, to stay behind. She was the only one who knew what the passage was supposed to look like. She was also the only one who had ever met a shepherd. Both of those facts were arguments, and she made them, and she won. The entrance was not in the wolf pits at all. It was under the hawthorn, in a slump of earth that had opened in January and that everyone had assumed was a badger working. It was not a badger working. 2 feet down, the soil gave way onto worked stone. Someone had built steps, not medieval steps, not Roman steps, steps cut into living rock and worn into deep bowls at the centre of each tread by the passage of feet. Over a length of time that Aldwine could not make himself calculate, they went down. The passage ran for what Osric estimated at a 1/4 mile, sloping, turning twice, the air getting warmer rather than colder, which is the wrong way for a cave and which none of them mentioned. There were carvings on the walls at intervals, the same spiral and line that hung on Aldwine's chest on a stone he had worn since he was 19. He put his hand on one of them as he passed it, and did not say anything about that either. And then the passage opened. The chamber, Aldwine writes, was larger than the abbey church at Bury. He could not see the ceiling. He could hear water somewhere below them, a great deal of water, moving slowly. And at the far end of it, the wall was broken. That is the only word he has for it, and he apologises for the word in the text and then uses it anyway. The rock was not open. There was no hole. The rock was cracked, the way ice on a pond cracks, in a great branching web perhaps 40 feet across, and through the cracks there was light. Green light, soft, low, evenly spread, colour of sun through leaves, and coming from a place where there could not be any light at all, because there were 100 feet of Suffolk clay on the other side of that wall. They walked toward it, and as they got closer the cracks stopped looking like cracks. They looked like the gaps between the leaves of a door that has warped. And through them Aldwine saw a country, fields, low, wide-roofed buildings with light coming from their windows, a road, a line of hills that he recognised, absolutely and immediately, because he had ridden along their base 4 times that year, and they were the hills between Woolpit and Elmswell, and they were standing exactly where they should be, in a landscape under an emerald sky where the sun had never risen. There was a village where Woolpit was. He could see the shape of it, in the middle distance, a cluster of roofs in the correct place, on the correct rise beside the correct stream. Beside him the girl made a sound he does not describe, and then he saw the figures. There were 6 of them standing on the other side, perhaps 30 feet back from the broken place, spread out in a loose line, tall, covered, each of them holding a small steady light that did not flicker. They were not moving. They were not approaching. They had, Aldwine realised, been standing there for some time. They were watching the door. And when he took 1 step closer, all 6 of them, at the same moment, without any signal he could see, turned their covered faces toward him. Nobody crossed. That is the part the story has to be honest about, and Aldwine is honest about it. He stood in that chamber for what he estimates at half an hour, close enough to a second world to feel the temperature of its air on his face, and he did not go through, and neither did Osric, and neither did the girl. The shepherds did not prevent them. They simply stood and held their lights and watched. And something about being watched by them made the idea of stepping forward feel less like a decision and more like a mistake you would make once. And in that half hour, in the green light, the girl finally told Aldwine the rest of it. He had asked her once, months earlier, why her people had never crossed. If they knew the caves were there and the shepherds only turned people back rather than killing them, then over 1,000 years, surely someone would have pushed through. Someone always pushes through. That is what people are. She had not answered him then. She answered him now, looking through a crack in the world at her own hills. She said, they have crossed. Some of them. Every so often, for as long as anyone remembers, someone gets through, and none of them ever come back. She said her people did not believe the bright country was heaven. That was an English idea, and she had let the English keep it because it made them kind to her. Her people had a different name for our world, and she gave it to him in her own language, and Aldwine wrote down the sounds as best he could and then wrote her translation beside it. The burning place. Everyone who goes there dies. That was simply a known fact. The way it is a known fact that you cannot breathe underwater. You could go. Nobody would stop you. You would not come back. And then she told him why the shepherds had let 2 children walk past them into a passage that everybody knew was fatal. Because St. Martin's land was ending. The light had been failing for generations, not suddenly. Slowly, over centuries, in a way that could be denied for a lifetime and could not be denied over 4 of them. Her grandmother had described a brighter sky. The old harvest songs described crops that no longer grew. The pale disk behind the clouds, the one people called a good omen, had been visible more often when her mother was a girl, and it was almost never visible now. The growing seasons were getting longer and thinner. The yields were dropping. There had been 2 bad decades in a row. Her people were not curious about the burning place. They were running out of time in their own. And so the shepherds, who had spent 1,000 years keeping everybody out of the deep caves, had begun, quietly, to let a very small number of people through. Not explorers, not ambassadors. Tests. 2 children, sent toward a sound, watched all the way, to see how long they would last on the other side. She said, they were not looking for a door. They were looking for somewhere to go. Aldwine stood in the green light and understood, finally, the true shape of the thing. He had been thinking of it as a discovery. Osric had been thinking of it as a containment problem. Rome had been thinking of it as a secret to be filed. It was none of those. It was a country of dying people, standing at the edge of a world they could not survive, looking across at all our sunlight and all our fast green wheat, and deciding slowly over generations that burning might be better than starving. They were not going to stop coming. They were going to keep sending children until one of them lived. The order arrived 4 days later, before dawn, which is how the order always arrived. There were 9 of them. They came from 3 directions and converged on the hawthorn field in the dark without a word, and Aldwine, who had not slept properly in a week and who was standing at the edge of the field when they came out of the mist, wrote that he had never in his life seen a group of men move with less discussion. They had done this before. That was the terrible thing. Every gesture was practiced. They did not destroy the passage. That is the detail the conspiracy insists upon, and it is the detail that matters most, because destroying it would have been simple. 9 men with picks and a winter's worth of rain could have brought that entrance down in an afternoon. Instead, they brought stones, 12 of them, carried on 2 carts, each about the size of a loaf, and each carved with the same spiral and line. They were not new. They were worn nearly smooth, and several had been repaired, and one had been broken and mended with lead. And Aldwine understood that these stones had been used before, in other fields, in other centuries, and carried away afterward and kept. They placed them in a ring around the slump in the earth, not evenly. According to some scheme that took 2 of them the better part of an hour to argue about, with measurements taken from the hawthorn and from the church tower and from something in the sky, and then they waited for the light to change, and when it did, they sang. Aldwine, who had spent his entire adult life in choir, did not recognise a note of it. It was not plainchant. It was in no language he could speak, not liturgy. It was in no language he knew, and he had 5. It went on for a long time, and it was not, he writes, beautiful. Halfway through it, the ground moved. Not violently. It settled, the way a house settles, one long sigh through the whole field, and the slump in the earth folded, gently in on itself, and became a dip in a pasture. The hawthorn leaned about a foot to the north and stayed there, and that was all. No light, no sound from below, no sense of an ending. Simply 9 tired men in a wet field at dawn, gathering up 12 stones and putting them back on a cart. Aldwine asked Osric whether it had worked, and Osric said the thing that Aldwine put at the end of that day's entry, and which is, in a story full of frightening lines, perhaps the most frightening one. He said, "It has worked here." Aldwine asked what he meant. Osric said that in 800 years the order had never sealed a door and had the count go down. He said the list had 19 locations on it when they went to Rome. He said that when he had checked it in January there had been 21. He said that the thin places were not a fixed set of holes in a wall. They were pressure. And you do not stop pressure by plugging one hole. You only decide where it comes out next. Then he got on his horse and rode away, and Aldwine never saw him again, and the journal contains no further mention of the Order of St. Veritas from that day forward. She could have gone. That is the thing to hold on to here at the end, and it is the reason this story is not really about doors or orders or archives at all. For 4 days between the crossing and the sealing, the passage under the hawthorn stood open, and the shepherd stood on the other side of it, and there was nothing and nobody stopping a 14-year-old girl from walking down those worn steps and going home. Aldwine writes that he did not try to persuade her either way. He says he had no right to, and that he suspects he stayed silent partly out of cowardice, because he did not want to be the man who told her to stay in the burning place. On the 2nd day she went down alone. He knew because he followed her at a distance and waited in the passage with his lamp shielded, and he could hear her very faintly talking to somebody in her own language for a long time. She came back up. She did not tell him what was said. He did not ask. On the 4th day she told him she was staying. Her reasons, as he records them, were not sentimental, and that is what makes them land. She said, "If I go back, they will know that a person can live over here." She said it plainly. She had spent 2 years in England. She had eaten English food and slept in an English house, and walked in English light, and she was alive, and her skin had turned the colour of everyone else's, and she was the single most dangerous piece of information in either world, because the whole thing had been an experiment. The shepherds had sent 2 children into the burning place to see what would happen. One of them had died in 5 weeks, exactly as expected, and that result was survivable news. It confirmed what everyone already believed. But she had lived. She had adapted. Slowly, painfully, hiding from the sun for a year, but she had done it. And if she carried that back through the passage, then every dying village in St. Martin's Land would learn, within a generation, that the bright country was survivable. Not comfortably, not safely, but survivable. And they would come. They would come in their thousands into a country of armed Christian kingdoms in the 12th century, and they would arrive weak and blind and burning, speaking no language anyone knew, with green skin, in an era that hanged women for owning the wrong cat. She said, "I know what happens to us here." She had watched her brother die of the sky. She had watched a cardinal arrive from Rome to collect her like a parcel. She had understood, at 13, something it takes most people a lifetime to learn, which is that the world does not have to be cruel on purpose in order to kill you. So she stayed, and she let the order close the door behind her, and she stood in that field at dawn while 9 men sang in a language nobody knew, and she watched the way home fold quietly into a dip in a pasture, and she did not make a sound. She was, at that moment, the only person in either world who knew both of them, and she chose to be the last. The historical record picks her up again after that, briefly and without ceremony. She learned English, she took a name, she married a man from King's Lynn, and she had children, and the chroniclers, who were not interested in her, note it in half a sentence and move on to other things, which means that somewhere in the east of England right now there are people walking around with her in them. They do not know it. They have ordinary names and ordinary jobs and ordinary faces, but if you go far enough back along certain family lines in Norfolk and Suffolk, according to the conspiracy, you arrive at a girl who was born under a green sky, and who came out of a hole in the ground in a harvest field, and who decided at 14 years old that an entire world should be allowed to keep believing that this one is fatal. She saved us by staying lost. Now come forward with me 870 years. The rest of it, you already know how it goes, because this is the part of the story where the modern world arrives with permits and lanyards and does exactly what the 12th century was afraid we would do. There is a road scheme in Suffolk. There is nearly always a road scheme in Suffolk, and because this is England, where you cannot dig a hole without hitting something older than your country, the road scheme requires an archaeological assessment, and the assessment requires trenches, and the trenches go in during a wet October in a field on the eastern edge of Woolpit. The dig is not exciting. Nothing about it is exciting. It is 4 people in high visibility jackets, a mini digger, and a great deal of coffee. On the 11th day, the digger's bucket comes up against work stone at a depth of about 2 metres. They stop the machine, which is procedure. They clean the surface by hand, which takes 2 days, and what emerges is a lintel and the top of an arch, and around the arch, cut into the stone, is a spiral and a line, repeated at intervals. Behind the arch, the passage is packed solid with rubble, deliberately packed. That is in the site report, and it is the detail that gets the dig its first small mention in the County Archaeology Bulletin. This was not a collapse. Somebody filled this passage by hand with graded material, working from the inside outward, and then sealed the entrance. It takes them 4 days to clear 11 feet of it. At 11 feet the rubble stops, and there is air behind it, and they put a camera through. The chamber on the other side is described in the preliminary report as a rock-cut void of indeterminate extent, which is the driest sentence ever written about anything, and the report includes photographs of the carvings on the walls. The carvings show 2 land masses side by side, similar but not identical. Between them runs a wide line that the report describes as a river or waterway, and spanning the line, connecting one landmass to the other, is an arch of radiating strokes that the report describes cautiously as a bridge with light emanating from it. Beneath the whole composition there is an inscription in Latin. It is short. The translation appears in a footnote on page 41 of a document that maybe 200 people have ever read. Pray they never remember the way home. The dig is suspended 8 days later. The stated reason is structural instability, and to be completely fair, that is an entirely reasonable thing to say about an 800-year-old rock-cut void under a public road, and if you were looking for a legitimate excuse to close a site, you could not ask for a better one. The site is backfilled. The road is realigned by 90 metres, at considerable cost, which raises no questions at all because road schemes get realigned constantly for reasons far stupider than this, and that would be the end of it. Except for the security camera, there is a camera on the site compound, because there is always a camera, because people steal diggers. It points across the compound at the equipment, and in the corner of its frame, out of focus and badly lit, is the open trench. On the night of the 29th, at 4 minutes past 3 in the morning, the camera records 11 seconds of a faint glow at the bottom of the trench. It is green. The footage is not dramatic. Nothing moves. It brightens. It holds. It fades. 11 seconds. It is the kind of thing that would be dismissed as a reflection, or a phone screen, or a sensor artifact, and it very probably is one of those things. But the site supervisor's field notebook for that week has one further entry, made at 3 in the morning, in handwriting that is noticeably worse than the rest of the page. It says that she was woken by bells. It says she lay there for some time, listening and counting, and that she counted 11. And it says, in a village where the church has one bell, and where the tower was locked, and where the nearest ring of bells is 9 miles away, and does not ring at 3 in the morning, that the sound was not coming from the village at all. It was coming from under the field. So here is where we end up. History remembers the Green Children of Woolpit as a medieval curiosity, a charming problem, something to put in a book of English oddities between the Wild Man of Orford and the Barnacle Geese, discussed politely by historians who offer perfectly sensible explanations and who are, in fairness, almost certainly right. Perhaps they were Flemish orphans, the children of immigrant weavers displaced by conflict, wandering out of Thetford Forest, speaking a dialect that Suffolk farmers genuinely might not have recognised. Perhaps the green was chlorosis, an anemia of severe malnutrition, which really does tint the skin, and which really does resolve when the diet improves. Perhaps the whole thing is a moral fable that 2 chroniclers wrote down because it was going around, the way things go around. Those are good answers. They are better answers, honestly, than the one we have spent this hour building. But according to the conspiracy, the reason the story survives is not that it is charming. It survives because it is the only one that got away. 11 accounts in Aldwine's journal, 19 locations on a list in Rome, and then 21. A Roman officer in the 2nd century writing a clean administrative report about 11 copper-coloured people who came up out of a mine. 900 years of strangers arriving and being collected, and the record stopping. All of them handled, all of them filed, all of them successfully made to have never happened. Except one. 2 children came out of a wolf pit in front of an entire village at harvest, in daylight, in front of too many witnesses, in a country with too many literate monks, and the story got out and into 2 separate chronicles before anyone could put a lid on it. And so the church did the only thing left to do with a secret that has escaped. It let it be adorable. It let the green children become a folk tale. It let them become beans and fairies and a bit of Suffolk whimsy. Because a story that everyone has heard and nobody believes is safer than a story that nobody has heard at all. A sealed secret can be opened. A ridiculous one is closed forever. The church never hid the children. The children were the diversion. It hid the door. And that leaves us with the last thought, the one I want you to take down into sleep with you tonight, because it is not really a frightening thought. It is a sad one, and sad thoughts sit better at this hour. For 800 years we have told this story as a story about 2 lost children. We have felt sorry for them. We have imagined them wandering, confused, in the wrong world, wanting to go home. According to the conspiracy, we had it exactly backwards. They were not lost. They knew precisely where they were and precisely what it was going to cost them, and they came anyway, because their sky was going out and somebody had to find out whether the burning place could be lived in. We were the ones who did not know where we were standing. A whole civilization, a step away, close enough that their bells come up through our floors on quiet nights, close enough that on certain afternoons in certain fields their light gets into our shadows, not above us, not below us, beside us, always beside us. There is a stretch of California desert where the heat bends the air into liquid glass on the horizon, where the mountains to the east look painted on, flat and theatrical, too perfect to be real, where the wind comes in low and dry and carries nothing with it, no sound, no scent, just the impression of enormous, patient silence. This is the Antelope Valley, and somewhere inside it, hidden behind layers of fencing and clearance levels and government language so deliberately dull it could put you to sleep on its own, there exists one of the most secretive engineering facilities in the history of human civilization. Most people have never heard its real name. Even those who have heard it tend to misunderstand what it actually is. It is not simply a laboratory. It is not simply an aircraft manufacturer. It is something stranger and older and more deliberate than either of those descriptions suggests. It is a place built around a philosophy that the most important things in the world must be done in the dark by people who will never be thanked, working on problems that officially do not exist. Its informal name comes from a cartoon, a moonshine operation in a comic strip called Leal Abner, tucked in the woods, producing something potent and unregulated and dangerous. The engineers who first worked there adopted the name as a kind of joke, a self-aware acknowledgement that what they were doing had no place in the normal world, that they were cooking something up that polite society was not ready to consume. They called it Skunk Works, and what happened inside it over the following 7 decades would reshape the sky above your head, rewrite the rules of what machines can do, and leave behind a paper trail so carefully shredded, so meticulously sanitized, that only fragments remain. Fragments that, if you know how to read them, point towards something the official history has never been able to fully explain. Tonight's story begins with one man trying to read those fragments, and what he found at the end of the trail, what he believes he found, has kept him silent for years, not because he was ordered to be silent, but because he is not entirely certain the world is ready to hear it. His name is Ethan Mercer, and this is the story he pieced together in the dark. Ast 1. Skunk Works. Ethan Mercer arrived at the Palmdale facility on a Tuesday morning in autumn. The drive from Los Angeles had taken him through suburbs that gradually dissolved into strip malls, then industrial parks, then open space that felt less like undeveloped land, and more like land that had deliberately been emptied of people. He remembers thinking that the facility itself looked almost disappointingly ordinary from the outside. Low buildings, chain-link fencing, security checkpoints that resembled the entrance to an unremarkable government office. Nothing to suggest that the work happening inside had helped define the last century of human flight. He had been recruited out of his graduate program at Caltech, where his dissertation had explored theoretical models for field interaction propulsion. The idea that rather than pushing against air or burning chemical fuel to generate thrust, a sufficiently advanced system might instead interact directly with the electromagnetic and gravitational fields that permeate all space. His advisors had called the work brilliant and impractical in roughly equal measure. The recruiter from Lockheed had called it exactly what they were looking for, without elaborating on what exactly they were looking for or why. The facility operated on what his new colleagues called the compartmentalization principle, though they never used that phrase out loud. Projects were divided into isolated cells. Engineers working on one system had no knowledge of adjacent systems. People who designed propulsion components did not speak to the people who designed airframe geometry. People who worked on sensor packages did not know what the aircraft those sensors would fly in even looked like. The whole operation functioned less like a single engineering team and more like a collection of strangers who had been placed in the same building by coincidence. In the early weeks, Ethan found this frustrating. He had come from an academic environment where ideas were shared freely, where conversations at lunch led to breakthroughs, where the whole point was to let one mind contaminate another with possibility. Here the culture was the opposite. You did your work. You did not ask about other work. You went home. You came back. The silence was not cold. His colleagues were warm, even funny, in the particular way that very intelligent people in confined circumstances often become. But the silence was absolute in the places that mattered. He told himself it was simply the nature of classified defence work. He told himself that the secrecy was necessary, reasonable, and entirely explained by the competitive realities of Cold War aerospace development, even in its long twilight. He told himself that what bothered him was not anything sinister, just the discomfort of a naturally curious person placed inside a system designed to limit curiosity. He was at this stage entirely wrong about that, but he did not know it yet. What he did notice, and what he could not quite explain away, was the historical problem. The thing that had first drawn him to aerospace physics as a child, that had felt like a puzzle with a missing piece for as long as he could remember. It was the speed, not the speed of aircraft, the speed of progress itself. Between the early 1940s and the early 1980s, human aerospace technology underwent a transformation so dramatic and so compressed that it strains the usual explanations of incremental scientific progress. In 1943, the dominant combat aircraft were propeller-driven machines of aluminum and fabric. 40 years later, the United States operated the F-117 Nighthawk, a stealth aircraft of such radical geometry, built from such exotic materials, incorporating such sophisticated electronic systems, that its existence was classified for a decade after it first flew. In between, humanity had also produced the SR-71 Blackbird, capable of sustained flight above Mach 3. The U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, operating at altitudes that made it effectively invisible to radar. Composite materials that did not yet have names in the mainstream engineering literature. Propulsion systems whose performance characteristics still strain credibility when reviewed today. Engineers who lived through this period often describe it with a kind of reverence. They speak of breakthroughs arriving faster than the theoretical groundwork that should have made them possible. Of solutions appearing before all the right questions had been asked. Of design choices that seemed, in retrospect, to have emerged from a destination rather than a starting point, as if someone already knew where they were going and was simply drawing the map backward. Ethan had always found this compression interesting from an academic perspective. Inside the facility at Palmdale, surrounded by the direct descendants of those programs, it began to feel like something else, something with edges, something that pointed somewhere specific. Act 2. The Archive. 3 months into his tenure at the facility, Ethan was assigned to review a set of archival propulsion studies from the 1950s and 60s. The assignment was routine, part of an effort to catalogue and digitise legacy materials before certain physical records were degraded beyond salvage. He was given a room, a scanner, a laptop, and a stack of manila folders that smelled of old paper and institutional patience. The kind of work that sounds tedious, and mostly is. He spent the first 2 weeks moving through the material without incident. Reports on jet engine tolerances, studies of combustion efficiency under varied atmospheric conditions, early computational models for airflow around unconventional geometries. Dense, technical, useful in the way that old records are always useful, as a foundation, a baseline, a reminder of how far things had come, and how slowly that distance had actually been covered step by step. Then, in the 3rd week, tucked between 2 folders on turbine blade metallurgy, he found a reference he had not been expecting. A document that cited in its footnotes the work of something called the Foreign Technology Evaluation Group. The citation was brief and clinical, a simple acknowledgement that certain material properties reviewed in the main document had also been noted in parallel work conducted by the FTEG. Nothing else. No further explanation. No dates beyond a vague reference to the mid-1950s. No names. The name itself was what bothered him. Foreign Technology Evaluation Group. The word foreign had a specific meaning in the aerospace defence context of that era. It meant enemy. It meant Soviet. It meant hardware captured on the battlefield, or purchased through intelligence networks, or reverse engineered from a downed aircraft. It was a reasonable thing for a defence contractor to study. The United States invested enormous resources in understanding what adversaries were capable of, and how far behind or ahead their own programs were. But Ethan knew the Soviet aerospace program of the 1950s reasonably well. It was not a secret. Its major achievements and its major limitations were well documented, and the material properties described in the footnote, the ones apparently shared between the main document and the FTEG research, did not match anything the Soviet program had produced or was known to have produced at that time. The tolerances were wrong, the temperature resistance was wrong, the density figures were wrong in ways that did not fit any manufacturing process of that era that he could identify, Soviet or otherwise. He made a note. He kept scanning. He told himself there was probably a simple explanation, a typo, a misclassified reference, a standard bit of bureaucratic imprecision from an era when documentation was not yet a science. He told himself this for about a week before he stopped believing it. Because the references kept appearing, not frequently, not obviously, but consistently, threaded through the archival material like a quiet motif in a piece of music you almost do not notice until you have heard it enough times to realise it has been there all along. The Foreign Technology Evaluation Group kept surfacing, in footnotes, in bibliographies, in the casual acknowledgement sections of reports that went on to discuss entirely unrelated engineering problems. Always peripheral, always just off-centre, never the main subject of anything. But present, with a regularity that felt deliberate rather than accidental, and the technology it referenced, the material properties, the performance characteristics, the operational parameters, never matched anything that belonged to the Cold War geopolitical landscape in which these documents had supposedly been produced. It was foreign in a way that the standard Cold War definition of that word could not comfortably contain. He began to look for the missing years, the developmental gaps. In conventional engineering history, progress has a texture. You can see the intermediate steps, the failed prototypes, the gradual refinement that eventually produces a breakthrough. The steps are not always public, but they leave traces. Funding requests, patent filings, academic papers that gesture toward problems that have not yet been solved. A shape in the record even when the details are absent. What Ethan found in the archival material was something different. Certain major advancements, particularly in radar-absorbing materials, in unconventional field interaction theories, and in what the documents euphemistically called inertial management concepts, appeared in the record with almost no preceding shadow. No fumbling early attempts, no transitional designs, just an absence, and then a presence, with very little in between to explain how humanity had crossed the distance, as if, in those particular areas, engineers had not worked their way toward a solution, as if they had been handed one. Act 3. The Black Triangle. In his 5th month at the facility, Ethan met a retired engineer at an informal gathering, one of the occasional low-key social events that the facility organised, ostensibly to build camaraderie among people who spent most of their professional lives not speaking to one another. The man was in his late 70s. He had the particular quality of someone who had spent decades carrying a weight that had compressed his posture slightly, bent him forward just enough that you could see the effort of standing straight. His name was not important, or rather it was not something Ethan ever shared when he spoke about this conversation later. They talked about aircraft. It was, in that room, the only entirely safe subject. The retired engineer spoke about early programs with the nostalgic affection of someone describing a beloved and difficult childhood. He mentioned the SR-71 with the reverence it deserved. He talked about the early stealth research with a measured pride, and then, after a second glass of something amber-coloured, he mentioned Nevada. Not Area 51 by name. That was not how people in that world spoke, then or now. He referred to the test ranges, the classified flight programs conducted in the desert basin north of Las Vegas during the late Cold War period. And within that context, without any apparent anxiety, he described aircraft that did not match anything in the public aerospace record. Large triangular craft. Dark. Not painted dark, but somehow absorbing light in a way that made them difficult to look at directly, as if the eye kept sliding off their surfaces. Moving in silence at low altitude. Not the muffled silence of an electric motor, but genuine total silence. The kind of silence that felt wrong, felt like an absence rather than simply a lack of sound. Capable of acceleration that should have been impossible given any reasonable estimate of their mass, and capable of something else, something the retired engineer described slowly and carefully, as if he had been thinking about how to phrase it for a long time. A distortion effect, a rippling in the air around them that was not consistent with any known aerodynamic phenomenon. Not turbulence, not heat shimmer, something else. Something that looked, he said, the way water looks just before it drains. A subtle, circular pulling inward that moved with the craft and vanished when the craft was gone. Ethan asked the obvious question, what were they? The retired engineer looked at him with an expression that contained layers, patience, something like pity, and underneath both of those something that looked very much like genuine unease. The scary part, the man said, wasn't what they could do. The scary part was that we didn't fully understand how they worked. He finished his drink. He set the glass down with the deliberateness of a man setting something larger and heavier down alongside it. And then he said one more sentence, quietly, without drama. The way you say things you have wanted to say for a long time and have finally given up trying not to say. We never built the original. He walked away after that. Ethan stood with the sentence in the air around him for a long time. He has never spoken to the man again. He's not entirely certain the man would remember saying it, but he has thought about it almost every day since. Act 4. The Recovery Theory. 7 months into his time at the facility, there was a server migration, a large-scale effort to transfer decades of physical and digital records into a new archival system, managed by a team of contractors who were working under significant time pressure and, as these things often go, not entirely in communication with one another about what exactly was being moved and where. In the resulting confusion, The kind of confusion that is perfectly ordinary and perfectly human and perfectly capable of producing extraordinary consequences. Ethan found himself with temporary access to a restricted archive that he was almost certainly not supposed to be able to reach. He discovered this access by accident, following a file pathway that should have terminated in a permission denial and instead opened into something else. He did not explore it immediately. He sat with it for almost 20 minutes, considering what to do. He is not someone who describes himself as particularly rule-bound, but he is also not someone who makes large decisions lightly. He thought about his career. He thought about his clearance. He thought about the retired engineer and his sentence, sitting in the air of that social gathering still waiting to be understood. Then he read. The documents he found in that restricted section were not dramatic in the way that conspiracy theories tend to imagine classified documents. There were no sensational headlines, no dramatic confessions, no photographs of anything impossible. What there was instead was a particular kind of language, the language of people who are trying very hard to describe something they do not have words for, the language of technical precision deployed in service of fundamental uncertainty, the language of people who know what they saw but cannot quite make it fit inside the vocabulary they were given. The oldest documents in the collection dated to the late 1940s. Their origin point was described in the most clinical possible terms as an incident in New Mexico. The word incident was doing enormous work in that context. It was carrying something that the documents were clearly designed to not fully contain, but also to not fully release. The geographic and temporal markers placed the incident in 1947 in the desert south of Roswell. But the documents were not about the incident itself. They barely mentioned it. They were about what came after, about the materials, about the components, about the fragments of something that had been recovered from a site that the documents referred to in rotating terminology that felt deliberately evasive as the collection area. The language used to describe the recovered materials was fastidiously, almost painfully, neutral. The documents never used words like alien, never used extraterrestrial, never used UFO or spacecraft or anything that would have committed them to a specific interpretation of what they were describing. Instead, they used phrases that had the clinical calm of someone describing an interesting rock formation, non-conventional aerospace structure, anomalous propulsion architecture, material of unknown manufacturing origin. The phrasing was designed to acknowledge the mystery while refusing to name it, to keep the door open without walking through it. Ethan recognized this linguistic strategy immediately. It was the same strategy that appears throughout the history of classified government documentation when the subject matter exceeds the conceptual frameworks of the people tasked with documenting it. You describe what you can measure, you describe what you can observe, and you leave the interpretation to someone else somewhere downstream who presumably will have better tools for the job. The implication of the documents was not ambiguous, even through the layers of careful neutrality. Something had come down in that New Mexico desert in the summer of 1947. It had not been a weather balloon, though that explanation was eventually offered and gratefully received by a public that was, in those years, deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. It had not been a Soviet aircraft, though that possibility was apparently considered and dismissed. It had not been any experimental American craft. The documents themselves were categorical about this, in the way that documents produced by the people who would have known about any experimental American craft can be trusted to be categorical. What it had been, the documents were careful not to say, but what it had left behind was described in enough detail to make very clear that whoever or whatever had made it had not been working from the same engineering tradition as the people now studying the debris. Act 5. Reverse engineering. The materials described in the restricted archive did not behave the way materials were supposed to behave. This is the kind of sentence that sounds theatrical when you first hear it, but which becomes something different when you read the technical reports that support it. Not theatrical, not dramatic, just deeply, quietly wrong, in a way that competent engineers found genuinely disturbing. The metallic layers, if metallic was even the right word, a question the documents themselves raised and then declined to settle, were thinner than any manufacturing process available in 1947 should have been capable of producing. Thinner than any manufacturing process available several decades later, for that matter. The tolerances were not simply impressive. They were categorically impossible, given the industrial capabilities of the era, and the reports that attempted to explain this impossibility by positing unknown advanced manufacturing techniques did not quite succeed in sounding confident about it. The material displayed properties that the engineers described as memory-like. When deformed under pressure, it returned to its original configuration. Not the way spring steel returns, not elastically through stored mechanical energy, but more slowly, more deliberately, as if it were making a decision, as if it remembered what shape it was supposed to be and was choosing rather than being forced to return to that shape. Researchers who worked with it over extended periods reported a quality that none of them could quite name precisely, but which several described independently as intentionality. The material did not feel passive, it felt oriented. It displayed electromagnetic responsiveness across a frequency range that did not correspond to any known material, meaning that certain electromagnetic inputs produced outputs, changes in the material's behaviour, in its thermal properties, in its surface characteristics, that could not be predicted by any existing model of electromagnetic interaction with matter. The material was not simply responding to inputs, it was responding to inputs that should not have had any effect on it. Its heat tolerance was, according to the documents, essentially beyond measurement. Standard testing equipment reached its limits before the material showed any significant thermal response. Researchers who attempted to determine a failure temperature eventually concluded that either the material had no failure temperature within any range they could test, or that the failure mechanism was so different from conventional thermal degradation that their methods were simply not capable of detecting it. They could not recreate it. This is the sentence that appears in various forms throughout the research documentation spanning several decades. We cannot recreate it. We cannot identify the manufacturing process. We cannot determine the base composition with confidence. We can measure its properties. We can document its behaviour. We cannot reproduce it. What they could do, what the program eventually concluded was the most productive use of its resources, was to extract principles, to look at what the material did and work backward toward concepts that could inform human engineering, even if the full replication remained out of reach. If the material demonstrated a particular electromagnetic response property, could human engineers design a system that achieved a similar response property through different means? If the material's geometry suggested a particular relationship between structure and function, could that relationship be expressed through available manufacturing methods even if the original method was inaccessible? This became the philosophy of the program, not to copy, to be inspired, to treat the recovered materials not as a blueprint to be followed, but as a destination to be approached from a different direction. The goal was not to build what had crashed. The goal was to let what had crashed teach humanity something about what was possible, and then to get to that possibility by whatever path human engineering could find. The conspiracy theory that Ethan began to construct from these fragments, quietly, over months, in his own notes, which he kept on paper rather than any networked device, was not that Lockheed and its government partners had simply stolen advanced alien technology and implemented it directly. The history of classified aerospace programs was too well documented, too full of genuine human struggle and genuine human failure to support that simpler narrative. What the evidence suggested to him was something more subtle and in its way more profound. That the great aerospace achievements of the Cold War era, the stealth aircraft, the extreme altitude reconnaissance platforms, the unconventional geometries and exotic materials that redefined what flight could be, were not simply products of human ingenuity working in isolation. They were products of human ingenuity given a direction, given a sense of what was possible, given a destination by something that had already arrived there, a very long time ago, by a route humanity still could not map. Ast 6. The Cold War cover. The cover worked because it did not require a single lie. It required instead a careful arrangement of truths, and no one arranges truths more effectively than a government operating under genuine existential threat, with genuine secrets to protect, in a genuine geopolitical environment where advanced aircraft really were being developed and really did look to civilian observers exactly like what the government wanted them to appear to be. The Cold War was, in this sense, the perfect environment for concealment of the deeper program. Every time a civilian in Nevada or California or New Mexico looked up and saw something impossible in the sky, the government had a ready-made explanation that was not only plausible, but often true. Advanced military testing, classified aircraft, experimental platforms whose characteristics were necessarily strange because they were pushing the edges of what flight could do. The explanation worked because it covered two separate categories of observation simultaneously: the genuinely classified conventional programs and whatever else was being studied and occasionally tested in those same desert skies. The SR-71, when civilians glimpsed it, looked like a UFO. It was long and dark and narrow, and moved at speeds that seemed impossible to eyes accustomed to commercial aircraft. The F-117, before its declassification, generated civilian reports of impossible triangular craft moving silently through night skies over Nevada and California. These reports were true. They were describing a real aircraft. The government declined to confirm it, which was appropriate, and the reports circulated in the same spaces as the stranger reports, which contaminated both categories with each other's uncertainty. The deeper genius of the arrangement, and Ethan found himself genuinely, reluctantly admiring it as a piece of strategic design, was that the government had never actually needed people to stop believing in unidentified aerial phenomena. They had only needed the subject to become socially untenable, unserious, associated with the kinds of people and the kinds of claims that serious persons did not engage with in public. This process was not purely manufactured. It was partly organic, a natural consequence of the anxiety and imagination of a population living through the nuclear age. But it was also, the document suggested, encouraged. Not through any dramatic disinformation program. Nothing as organised or as risky as that. Simply through the strategic placement of sufficiently absurd material into the conversation. The tabloids, the sensational claims, the increasingly baroque elaborations that accumulated around the core of genuine strangeness. These did not need to be manufactured. They only needed to not be discouraged. They needed to be allowed to flourish, because their flourishing served the program's interests perfectly. Once the subject was associated with tabloid culture, with people who believed the Earth was flat and that Elvis was still alive, and that the moon landings had been filmed on a soundstage, serious discussion of genuine anomalous phenomena became professionally suicidal. Credentialed people who encountered strange data quietly buried it, or reframed it in neutral terminology. Credible witnesses who reported unusual observations were gently invited to consider more conventional explanations. The ridicule did not need to be enforced. It had become self-enforcing, a social mechanism that operated automatically and required no maintenance. The ridicule, Ethan realised, was the security system, more effective than any classification level, more durable than any non-disclosure agreement. The classification might be broken by a whistleblower, a leak, a legal challenge. The ridicule could not be broken from the outside. It had to collapse from within, and it was still, very largely, intact. Act 7. The Propulsion Secret. The deepest section of the restricted archive, the material that Ethan spent the longest time with, that he returned to repeatedly over the hours he had access, that he has spent the years since trying to fully reconstruct from memory, dealt with propulsion. With the specific question of how the craft he was reading about had actually moved through the air and apparently through space. With the physics underlying what witnesses described and what sensor data had captured during test range observations in the late Cold War period, conventional aerospace propulsion is, at its most fundamental level, a negotiation with Newton. You push against something, air, chemical exhaust, ionized particles, and the reaction moves you in the opposite direction. This is true whether you are a propeller aircraft or a rocket. The medium changes, the scale changes, the elegance and efficiency of the negotiation changes dramatically over time. But the fundamental transaction remains. You push, the universe pushes back, you move. What the classified research documents described was something categorically different. Not a more efficient version of the conventional negotiation, not an unconventional propellant or a more powerful combustion system. Something that did not engage in the negotiation at all. A system that, in the language of one document that Ethan found particularly striking, achieves propulsion through local field displacement rather than reactive thrust. The concept sounds abstract until you work through what it actually implies. Rather than pushing against the environment, such a system manipulates the environment itself. Rather than negotiating with the space the craft is moving through, it alters the properties of that space locally, changes the gravitational or electromagnetic characteristics of the region, immediately surrounding the craft in a way that produces motion without thrust. The craft does not push through space. It changes what space is doing around it and rides the change. This concept, in various theoretical forms, had existed in the fringes of physics research for decades. It was not, in principle, impossible. It violated no fundamental laws of physics, only the practical constraints of human engineering capability and available energy generation. Mainstream physics had explored versions of it academically. The work had never produced anything operational because the energy requirements, by all conventional calculations, were so staggering as to be effectively prohibitive. Unless, the restricted document suggested, you already knew from direct evidence that operational versions of such a system were possible. Unless you had fragments of something that had crossed the distance between stars, or something even stranger, sitting in a laboratory and proving by its mere existence that the energy problem had a solution, even if that solution remained out of reach. This was the key insight that Ethan believed the program had provided to human aerospace engineering. Not a blueprint for field displacement propulsion, but confirmation that it was real, that it worked, that the universe contained somewhere in its physical laws a path to propulsion that made conventional reactive thrust look like striking a fire with two rocks, and that confirmation, even without the implementation details, had reshaped the direction of classified research in ways that were still reverberating decades later. It explained the reports, the decades of civilian and military observations of aerial phenomena that moved in ways that should have been impossible, silent at high speed, capable of acceleration that would have turned any biological pilot into vapour, executing course changes that the physics of reactive thrust propulsion simply could not support. These behaviours were not violations of physics. They were applications of physics that human civilization had not yet independently reached. They were what field displacement propulsion looked like from the outside. The craft were not defying the laws of the universe. They were operating under laws that humanity had only recently begun to suspect existed. Laws that, absent the discovery in the New Mexico desert in 1947, human science might not have even begun seriously investigating for another century. Act 8. The scary realization. Ethan had spent months in the restricted archive material by the time he reached what he later described as the pivot point. The moment when the story he was telling himself, the story of a government that had successfully recovered advanced technology and, through decades of patient reverse engineering, gradually mastered its secrets, collapsed into something much less reassuring. He had assumed, reasonably enough, that the passage of time meant progress, that the programs he was reading about, programs that had been running since the late 1940s, funded at levels that dwarfed most of the rest of the defence budget, staffed by the most talented engineers and scientists the country could recruit, must have, by the time he was sitting in that room reading their files, achieved something approaching full understanding of what they were studying. Nearly 80 years of work. Nearly 80 years of the most capable human minds applied to a finite set of recovered materials. Surely by now the mystery had been solved. The later documents, the most recent materials in the restricted archive, dated to within the last few years, told a different story. Not a story of mastery, not a story of breakthrough and eventual comprehension. A story of ongoing, fundamental, apparently irreducible uncertainty. The materials were still not fully understood. The propulsion principles had been described theoretically but not successfully reproduced at any operational scale. The memory-like behaviour of the structural components had been documented in exhaustive detail and explained in exactly 0 satisfying ways. The electromagnetic response properties had been measured 10,000 times and still fit no model that human physics had produced. One document, dated to the 21st century, contained a line that Ethan has never been able to stop thinking about. It appeared in a technical review section, buried between 2 paragraphs of engineering jargon, delivered in the flat, affectless prose of someone reporting a measurement that happened to be a measurement of the limits of all human knowledge. It read, "No successful reproduction event has matched observed source performance. 80 years. The most capable engineering program in human history. And the best they could say was that they had gotten closer. That they had built things that were inspired by what they had found. That they had extracted principles and followed those principles to the edges of human capability. But they had not reproduced it. They could not build what had crashed in that desert. Not even close. Not even a version that approached the original's capabilities at a fraction of the scale. This was not the story of a government hiding its triumph. This was the story of a government hiding its uncertainty. The secrecy was not the secrecy of people who possessed something extraordinary and feared what the world would do if it knew. It was the secrecy of people who possessed something extraordinary and feared what the world would do if it knew how little they understood it. The cover-up was not protecting a secret weapon. It was protecting the knowledge that the secret weapon was still, fundamentally, beyond reach. And underneath that realization was something darker still. Something Ethan sat with for a long time before he was willing to fully articulate it, even in his private notes. If the program had been running since 1947, with access to physical materials of non-human origin, with the resources of the United States government and its defense industrial complex fully committed to the task, and if, despite all of that, they still could not reproduce what they were studying, then what did that say about the gap between human capability and whatever had built the original? It said the gap was not small. It said the gap was not the kind of gap that a few more decades of determined research would close. It said the gap was so large that nearly 8 decades of the most intense technological effort in human history had not visibly narrowed it. The world's most advanced aerospace technology was not evidence that humanity was approaching the frontier. It was evidence that humanity had found the frontier, stared into it, and come back with scraps. Act 9. The observation theory. There was one more layer. Ethan found it in the deepest part of the restricted archive, in documents that were older and stranger than anything else he had accessed, and it was the layer that disturbed him most profoundly. Not because it was more dramatic than what came before, but because it implied something about the nature of the situation that he had not previously considered. The files contained data on what they called aerial activity spikes, periods during which the monitoring systems at test ranges and classified facilities recorded significant increases in unidentified aerial phenomena, craft or objects behaving in ways that exceeded the capabilities of any known human aerospace technology, observed over or near facilities where classified work on recovered materials was being actively conducted. These spikes correlated with specific periods in the program's history. They were not random. They clustered around moments of what the documents described as significant technical advancement, points at which the program had made some meaningful progress in understanding or applying what it had recovered. The implication was uncomfortable in a way that the documents tried, and largely failed, to suppress behind their customary clinical language. Whatever had originally built the recovered materials might have been monitoring human progress, might have been aware, through mechanisms the documents did not attempt to explain, of when human engineers were getting closer to understanding what had been left behind, and might have, in response to that awareness, increased the frequency of something that the documents declined to characterize definitively, but which, in context, looked very much like surveillance. This produced a fracture inside the program. The documents recorded it with the careful neutrality of institutional history, trying to be fair to all sides of a genuine dispute. Some analysts and researchers concluded from the correlation data that the phenomenon was extraterrestrial, that it originated with beings from somewhere beyond the solar system who had, at some point in the past, visited Earth and left behind, intentionally or otherwise, materials that now served as a kind of beacon or test. Others argued for explanations that did not require a straightforward extraterrestrial framework. The objects, some believed, might not originate from another planet. They might originate from another time, or another dimension, in whatever sense that phrase could be given physical meaning, or from something that the current framework of human consciousness was simply not equipped to categorize correctly. The uncertainty fueled paranoia in the way that genuine uncertainty always does. Factions developed, actions, interpretations calcified into something approaching ideology. People who spent their careers inside the program sometimes emerge from it with radically incompatible understandings of what they had spent their lives studying, not because they had different information, but because the information itself refused to resolve into a single coherent picture. What Ethan took from this section of the archive was not a conclusion about what the aerial activity spikes meant. He was, and remains, genuinely uncertain about that. What he took from it was a reframing of the entire situation. Because if the correlation was real, if something was paying attention to humanity's attempts to understand what had been left behind, then the program was not simply a research effort. It was a relationship, an asymmetric, largely one-sided, probably incomprehensible relationship between human civilization and something that operated by rules that made the word relationship inadequate, in ways that were themselves inadequate to describe. And human civilization, in this framing, was the junior partner, by a very considerable margin. Act 10. The final black file. The deepest compartment in the restricted archive was not a folder or a file directory in the conventional sense. It was a designation, a security classification layer that sat above everything else Ethan had accessed, visible only because the server migration had briefly created a gap in the access controls through which its existence could be inferred, even if its contents could not be fully read. He saw enough of it to understand its scope. He read a single briefing document from its outer layer before the access closed. He has spent years thinking about what was in the one sentence that stayed with him. The briefing document was a summary, an executive-level overview of the program's history and current status, written in the kind of language that is designed to be read by people who are very powerful and very busy and need to understand a situation in minutes rather than months. It covered the origin of the program, the history of the recovered materials, the achievements made in applying derived principles to classified aerospace development, the continuing limitations of the reverse engineering effort, and then, near the end, the sentence, "No successful reproduction event has matched observed source performance." He already knew this from the earlier technical documents, but seeing it here, in an executive briefing stated flatly at the highest classification level available, without qualification or optimism about future prospects, gave it a weight it had not carried before. This was not a researcher's careful notation of a temporary setback. This was the program's official position, communicated to the people who controlled its funding and its direction, nearly 8 decades after it had begun. They could not build what had crashed. They had built things that were extraordinary by any human standard. They had things that redefined what aerospace engineering meant, and none of it matched the source. The greatest aerospace achievements of the modern era, viewed through this lens, were not the summit. They were base camp. The evidence of how far humanity had climbed was also, simultaneously, the evidence of how much remained above. Ethan closed the connection when the access terminated. He sat in the room for a long time without moving, the scanner humming beside him, the stack of manila folders still waiting to be processed. He He had come to the facility to work on propulsion theory. He was leaving with something that made propulsion theory feel like the very first page of a book whose later chapters were written in a language that did not yet exist. He finished his work at the facility. He filed his reports. He attended his meetings. He said nothing to anyone about what he had found, partly because he understood what saying something would cost him, and partly because he was not sure what saying something would even mean. What do you report? To whom? In what language do you say that the foundation of the entire Black Project world is not mastery of something extraordinary, but incomprehension of something incomprehensible? He left the facility 2 years later. He took a position at a university. He published on field interaction propulsion theory in academic journals. He did not publish anything about the restricted archive. He kept his paper notes in a location he declined to specify. He began quietly to talk to other people, other engineers, other researchers who had worked in adjacent spaces, and found, with a frequency that he described as both validating and deeply unsettling, that versions of his discovery were not as isolated as he had thought, that the fragments he had found were fragments of a larger pattern that was visible, dimly, from many different angles, that he was not the first person to piece something together from the peripheral references and the careful evasions and the too clean official explanations. He was simply one of the few who had gotten close enough to the centre to see its shape. Epilogue. The sky above the desert years past. Ethan Mercer became a name that circulated very quietly in particular circles, not famous, not public, known to a small community of people who paid close attention to the spaces where official explanations stopped making full sense. He gave no interviews. He published nothing about the archive. He answered no questions that he had not already decided how to answer. Over the Nevada desert, triangular craft continued to appear in civilian accounts. They moved silently. They accelerated in ways that prompted people who saw them to use words like impossible, like physics doesn't apply, like the air itself was moving with it rather than resisting it. The accounts were collected by enthusiasts and catalogued by researchers and largely ignored by institutions. Occasionally they attracted brief attention from news organisations, which covered them with a tone that was always slightly amused, always slightly condescending, always calibrated to communicate that this was interesting, in the way that a curiosity is interesting, not in the way that something important is important, exactly as intended, exactly as designed, the security system running as designed, with no maintenance required. People who pressed too hard on the subject found that it became slippery in a particular way, not suppressed directly, not threatened into silence, not legally silenced in most cases, just made difficult, made professionally costly, made socially uncomfortable, made to feel, from the inside, like pushing against a wall that was not quite there but also was not quite absent. The ridicule did its work without a hand to guide it. Self-organising, self-perpetuating, as stable and self-reinforcing as any well-designed system gets to be. Ethan's last recorded journal entry, shared with a single person who shared it with Ethan's reluctant permission, and then with no one else for a long time, contained no revelations about specific programs or specific materials. It contained no names, no dates, no technical specifications. It contained only an observation. The kind of observation that arrives at the end of a very long process of thinking, when the thinking has gone far enough to circle back to something that was always true, but that now means something different than it did at the start. He wrote, "The greatest secret was never that they recovered something. The greatest secret was how little of it we actually understand. The desert outside the Nevada test ranges is quiet tonight. The mountains are dark against a sky that is very large and very full of stars. Somewhere up there, something is moving in ways that make the word flying feel inadequate. Something that has been moving this way for a very long time, through skies above civilizations that rose and fell and left their own records of impossible lights above the horizon. Whether it knows we're watching, or whether it cares, or whether the categories of knowing and caring even apply to whatever it is, These are questions that the deepest classified archive in the most secretive engineering facility in human history has been trying to answer for nearly 8 decades. It has not yet succeeded.